I will give you just one or two little biographical details of Roger Wyatt. He was educated at Christ College, Cambridge, and awarded a first in history and history of art, which at that period really means something. And then he carried on postgraduate research at Wadham College, Oxford, under Sir Howard Colvin. Whilst he was at university, he revived University Architectural Society, organized lectures by such luminaries as Lord Clark, Sir Nicholas Pevsner, who wrote the guides to the counties, Sir John Summerson, the great authority on Georgian architecture, and the infamous Sir Anthony Blunt, a man of many parts. And he also organized architectural excursions, which is something which we are trying to develop. He then worked as a research historian with the Historic Buildings Department of the old GLC, which was the London Council. And then he became the secretary of the Georgian Group for 8 years. And the Georgian Group is a body based in London which defends the architecture of the 18th century, which for this purpose stretches from the end of the 17th to the beginning of the 19th century. And thereafter, he spent 4 years as the executive secretary of the Garden History Society, which I think probably explains a bit the subject of his book, which he's going to be talking about this evening. Since 1996, he's been a freelance architectural historian, and his activities have included lecturing on both sides of the Atlantic, leading architectural tours, and writing books and numerous articles, in particular in Country Life magazine. And that's how I came across an article which he will be talking about very briefly at the beginning of his talk. His definitive work on the cottage orné, which I brought along my copy for you to have a look at, was published in 2017 and will be reissued next year. Oh, this year, actually. And last year, he published his second book, Georgian Arcadia. Again, there's a specimen copy there, and you've got the little leaflets, which had warm, very warm reviews, rave reviews. And that is going to be his main subject for this evening. So would you please just give a round of applause to warm up the room for Mr. Roger Wyatt.
Normally, I don't have any difficulty making myself heard without a microphone, but I'm down with a very heavy cold at the moment, and my voice is rather husky. So if you find I'm difficult to hear, I apologize, and you can always put your hand up and ask me to repeat it. I've been asked to start by saying a few words about planning and housing, which is not the main topic of my talk, on account of an article I had in Country Life about recent housing in Dorset, which I think was about a year ago. I've slightly forgotten. So I'm just going to read out some random thoughts that I jotted down. Almost wherever you go in the country, for instance, if you take the train up to London and look out of the window as you pass through Andover or Basingstoke, the fields are being built over with large housing estates of the most basic and banal kind. These are generally run up by a small number of very big developers, Persimmon, Bovis, and so on, who for the most part don't actually employ proper architects, nor do they need to, because they use a small number of generic designs that vary very little at all wherever they are in the country. These developers can afford to offer landowners more than small local developers can, thus pricing out the latter from the market. But at the same time, their business model maximizes profit. Persimmon, for instance, works on the basis of a 30% profit margin per house. So it really goes without saying that they have very little interest in tailoring their estates to the architectural traditions of the different areas they build in terms of materials or idioms. So the result is that their schemes have no sense of place. A local example of this, local to me anyway, is the Corelli estate currently going up on the edge of Sherborne. When this development was first mooted, West Dorset District Council, which of course no longer exists, produced an excellent design guide with very good advice on things like materials and layout. But not being compulsory, this was comprehensively ignored by Persimmon. The Corelli development has been a scarring experience for Sherborne Castle estates, which sold the land for it, and the estates have vowed never to allow Persimmon to develop any of its land ever again. But I doubt if this lesson has been learned by other Dorset landowners. In fact, I gather Persimmon has an option on at least some of the land proposed for the North Dorchester development, which is a very depressing prospect, I think. The sad thing is that there is no real excuse for this, because on the doorstep in Poundbury, Dorset and its landowners have an exemplar of a large development into which a great deal of thought has gone. Above all, this is because the present king, and of course former Prince of Wales, in him, Poundbury has a landowner who cares passionately about producing designs that draw on the lessons both of the past and of the locality, to produce results which have a real sense of place. You may or may not like the way Poundbury looks, and personally I think the architects had an unfortunate rush of blood to the head when it came to designing Queen Mother Square. But you could certainly not claim that this is for any lack of thought and well-intentioned planning and design. You've only to look at those estates at Andover and Basingstoke or Corelli and Sherborne to see this. Frankly, in my view, there's no excuse for anyone to propose a poorly designed development for North Dorchester, and there would be no excuse if Dorset Council, of whose planning department I have to say I have quite a low opinion, were even to consider granting permission for one. Whether there should be a development on that site at all is, of course, another matter altogether, and for another occasion, I think. Now, to get on with the meat of this evening, this, as you no doubt realize, is a general view of Stourhead, just over the border in Wiltshire. Garden buildings, which is what I'm basically talking about, are not, of course, an invention of the Georgian period. They'd existed in Elizabethan gardens and very probably medieval ones too. But this was always in the context of a formal garden layout. The revolutionary development away from formality and into informality that began first in English parks and gardens in the early 18th century is what truly liberated the garden building as an architectural form, and the park at Stourhead is a prime example of this. Stourhead is an example of what's known as the English landscape garden, which has often been said to be this country's most original contribution to European civilization. And if so, Stourhead is the finest example, in my opinion. Now, it's all about a circuit. The way this was done was very much a function of the English landscape park as it developed, as it cast loose from the corset of formality with which British gardens entered the 18th century. In the new approach, evolved by designers such as William Kent and theorists like Alexander Pope and Joseph Addison, visitors were encouraged to treat gardens and landscapes as circuits, experienced on foot, on horseback, by carriage, or by boat, because water, notably lakes, were very much a feature of the style. Okay, fine. An example of what I'm talking about, of people moving around in these landscape parks, is shown here in this painting of Audley End in Essex, where you see visitors arriving at Robert Adams' Temple of Victory in 1789. Audley End, the great Jacobean mansion, is in the background. There we are. But here we've got people, a couple in a horse-drawn carriage, somebody else, in fact, three other people accompanying them on horseback. And of course, you could, if you were feeling energetic, also walk up to the, there we are, up to the temple. And as I said, water was important. So another way of getting around is by boat. And so we get some very fine boat houses put up in these parks, of which this is one of the best. This is at Kedleston in Derbyshire, and that was designed by Robert Adam. And you have the three arches at the bottom, which is where the boats would slide in and out. Behind, on one side, is a changing room. There's a cold bath into which you could take the plunge, and there's the all-important loo. And then when you've got thoroughly chilled one way or another, you go upstairs to this here, which is an example of a lovely Robert Adam interior with very pretty plasterwork, where there was a fireplace and they'd no doubt be refreshments laid on. As you were moving around the landscape, you'd probably from time to time want to sit down and admire the view. And it's clear that in a lot of these landscapes, the owner or the person who designed it had a very definite idea of where he wanted you to sit down and admire the view. You could sit in one of these seats to admire the view. You could have a volume of poetry. You could be with your girlfriend or boyfriend and have a bit of canoodling and so on. This is a rather pretty chinoiserie example at a not very well-known garden in Oxfordshire called Sandford Park, which actually faces both ways. You can see there is the alcove with a fitted seat, the original fitted seat going around, and there's an identical alcove facing in the opposite direction to another pool. In both directions, it faces over a pool of water. From these seats, very often the next destination could be seen. So you'll be led on from one building to another. This is what I mean about structuring the landscape. And in fact, if you remove all these architectural embellishments, the landscape becomes essentially amorphous and unstructured. So the buildings are absolutely crucial to it. And you might, on a very distant hilltop, see a tower, and you'd make your way up there. This is an example you may know. This is at Haldon, High Haldon, above Exeter. It's a triangular Gothic tower, dates from about 1770 as far as I remember. And there's a very pretty room on the first floor with a fireplace where you could go and have refreshments. This was a field of design in which most of the great names of Georgian architecture contributed. Sir Christopher Wren, Sir John Vanbrugh, Nicholas Hawksmoor, William Kent, James Gibbs, William Chambers, Robert Adam, James Wyatt, John Soane. Amongst them, I'm going to show you examples by all those great men. And it was, moreover, a category which often prompted some of their best ideas. This is on the front cover of my book. This is the pavilion at Rest Park in Bedfordshire by Thomas Archer, who was one of the leading Baroque architects of this country. And it's triangular. It's on a very complicated plan. It's actually two superimposed triangles, which are resolved by a central circular domed room with frescoes. So it's really quite complicated and certainly a very expensive building. Now, one reason why architects had good ideas about these buildings was that almost without exception, they weren't buildings in which the owner of the estate was going to have to live. So there were fewer practical considerations to take into account. This meant that architects could experiment, both with architectural form and with new styles, as the results weren't going to actively inconvenience the people who paid the bills. And liberated from the tiresome constraints of where to put the chimneys, or where the client's wife wanted a larger dressing room or whatever, they could let their imaginations soar. They could toy with mathematical ratios, with complicated plans, with the harmonic relation of solid to void, and, oh, thank you, and probably no one would be inconvenienced by the results. One of the building types which was pressed into service to ornament the landscape was the mausoleum. And of course, in the case of a mausoleum, the occupants were dead. So they were certainly not going to be inconvenienced. And some of the very finest buildings in Georgian landscape parks are actually there to house the dead. This is the mausoleum Brocklesby in Lincolnshire, designed by James Wyatt. One of his finest designs dates from the 1860s. The only exceptions where a building would be occupied is where an estate worker was expected to live there, as they probably would if the building was intended as an entrance lodge to an estate. In that case, sorry, lodges come later. In that case, the architectural effort would probably be confined to the exterior, which was what the estate owner and his guests saw. And of course, no effort would be made with internal decoration or creature comforts. Now, because of this fact, this was the architectural field par excellence where new styles could be tried out. From the 1720s, this might well be Gothic, which was then an unfamiliar style. You have to remember that at the time, most architects designed in the classical style. So here is an early example. This is the temple at Shotover near Oxford, which may date from as early as about 1720. Or style might be chinoiserie. This is something that was never really attempted on country houses, but for a while it was all the rage with garden buildings. This is the Chinese pavilion at Stowe, which was first recorded in 1728. So it's actually the earliest surviving example of a Chinese building in this country. It was restored in the 1990s by the National Trust and very nicely done. I suppose the most famous chinoiserie building is, of course, the pagoda at Kew. In fact, Kew had a trio of exotic buildings or buildings in exotic styles. You have the pagoda on the left, which still exists, which certainly at the time of it was built, was the tallest load-bearing brick structure in Europe. And that's designed by Sir William Chambers, architect to George III. And then just disappearing on the left is the Alhambra, which of course, as the name suggests, was evoking exotic Moorish Spain. And then in the distance on the right, you have the mosque, which self-evidently was evoking also Moorish buildings, perhaps in Constantinople or somewhere like that. The garden and park were also the place where the Greek revival appears for the first time. Until the 1750s, it hadn't really occurred to anybody who was designing in the classical style to look further than Rome, to ancient Rome. And of course, the majority of buildings in the classical style were inspired by Roman examples. The reason for this is that until the 1750s, nobody had really gone to Athens, because Athens was part of the Ottoman Empire and was very dangerous to get to. But in the 1750s, an architect called James Stewart, who later became known as James Athenian Stewart, and his chum Nicholas Revet went all the way to Athens and traveled around Asia Minor and eventually produced magnificent volumes of engravings of the buildings they had seen. And probably the very first building to be put up in Europe in the Greek style since classical antiquity is this little building, the Temple of Theseus, which was put up to adorn the park at Hagley in Worcestershire. Athenian Stewart was also the designer of this rather splendid arch at the estate at Shugborough near Stafford, which belongs to the National Trust. This, I think, is probably the finest arch in any English park, the Arch of Hadrian of the 1760s. Now, another feature which you find in garden buildings is an interest in new technology. This was found particularly in orangeries and greenhouses and glasshouses. It was increasingly realized that success with growing tender plants, especially orange trees, depended on achieving as large a proportion of window to wall as possible. So as the 18th century goes on, we see the introduction of thinner and thinner glazing bars through the use of metal rather than wood. This resulted in what might be called the architectural component, such as classical columns, gradually being replaced as the buildings became lighter and airier. So that by the end of the Georgian period, we have glass and metal bubbles that look forward to their Victorian apotheosis in the Crystal Palace. I'm just going to show you a sequence to show what I mean. This is the orangery at Kensington Palace, designed for Queen Anne by Sir John Vanbrugh and Nicholas Hawksmoor. Very grand, very expensive. And you'll see that although there are large windows, there's also quite a lot of solid brickwork. The windows had to be tall enough so that you could slide the lower part of the sash up and be able to carry the orange trees out without knocking the top off. So that's what you see here in the orangery at Kensington Palace. But then as the century goes on, the windows get bigger, the architecture shrinks. This is the orangery or greenhouse at Croom Court in Worcestershire, designed by Robert Adam in about 1760. And you can see how the lower part of the sash slides right up, enough for them to carry the pots in and out, or in fact, if necessary, the whole window could be removed from its slot. So you just had a kind of transparent masonry structure with no glass to get in the way. A little bit later on, this is the orangery at Barnsley Park near Cirencester of 1809, designed by John Nash, Prince Regent's architect, designed the Royal Pavilion, Buckingham Palace and so on. And what you've got here is basically a classical temple with columns and a pediment and so on, but it's completely transparent. You can see between the columns are these tall pairs of doors, which are metal framed, which fold open in the summer and then they close. The pediment at the end, the triangular bit, with the circular glazing, that can be opened as well. And what's interesting about this particular orangery is that John Nash, who was very interested in new technology, persuaded the owner to cough up, not for the ordinary cast iron or wrought iron, but stainless steel from Sheffield. And the thing about stainless steel, as the name implies, is it doesn't rust. And so although many other orangeries with metal glazing did rust, this one never has. And so in the long run, the extra expenditure was rather a wise investment. This is the great orangery, great conservatory rather, at Syon Park on the outskirts of London, which is really like a Byzantine church, but made transparent. The columns are metal. In fact, almost everything about it is metal, although stone is used on the outside facades. And at the center, you have this wonderful bubble-like glass dome. And then you reach a kind of logical conclusion to this development at Bicton with the Palm House of the 1820s, where there's no architecture at all. It's all metal and glass. And this is what I mean when I say this looks forward to the Crystal Palace and the other high-tech innovations of people like Sir Joseph Paxton. We also find technological innovation as the fruits of the Industrial Revolution were pressed into use. For instance, in the garden of Goldney House at Clifton in Bristol, there's a Gothic tower built in about 1760, specifically to house an engine produced by Abraham Darby's ironworks in Colebrookdale. The purpose of this expensive bit of kit was to pump water up from the River Avon, which is over 100 feet below. There's no water really up at Clifton. So the water was pumped up from the River Avon into a tank at the top of this tower for purposes that I will reveal very shortly. Elsewhere in Bristol, you have a place called Arno's Court. The main road from the centre of Bristol to Bath goes through the estate. And in the 18th century, it belonged to a local copper smelter called William Reeve, who used industrial slag from his furnaces, which was very, very dark, sort of inky, mauvey black, which was cut into rectangular blocks. And with those, he constructed his stable block, built in 1764, which Horace Walpole, the doyen of Strawberry Hill, said he thought looked like the Devil's Cathedral. Now, the Arno's Court stables are an example of a very extensive category of structures that, while they're essentially practical and indeed prosaic in purpose, were nevertheless pressed into service to double as embellishments to the garden or the landscape. And one of the grandest examples, these must be the grandest dog kennels in the British Isles, if not in Europe. This is the building known as Châtellerault, which is on the estate of the Dukes of Hamilton, to the south of Glasgow. The enormous house, the palace of the Dukes, was pulled down, I think, in the 1920s or thereabouts. But this building remained on the skyline. You looked up at this. This is what punctuated the skyline in the view from the mansion. Needless to say, the dogs didn't live in this rather palatial building. They lived in pens behind. But in the building, you have banqueting rooms there. A his and hers banqueting room for the Duke and the Duchess with wonderful Baroque plasterwork. You also get farm buildings dressed up to make a visual effect. This is the so-called castle barn on the Badminton estate, the estate of the Dukes of Beaufort in South Gloucestershire. It is basically a big barn. You can see it extending back, and then there are yards enclosed by walls in which you would, I don't know, do whatever you do with what was in the barn, which I suppose was hay, corn. But it's all dressed up on this side to make it look like an ancient Roman fortress, and you can see it for at least a mile across the fields as you drive through the estate. Here at Exton in Rutland, you have a combined dovecote and cowshed. The dovecote is the tower, and the cowshed is wrapped around part of the perimeter. And you can see that it has been designed with a view to being reflected in the lake. So you sit in the house, which is behind us, and you look across the lake, and there is this charming Gothic building reflected in the water. Tong in North Shropshire has a Gothic cowshed and also an Egyptian pigsty put up by a rather eccentric owner at the beginning of the 19th century. I've actually inspected the pigsty. It's got an inscription which says "for the piggies," but they must have been jolly small piggies, because the only sort of way in is a rather small slot at the bottom. So I think there must have been piglets rather than pigs. Elsewhere on the estate, there's a rather wonderful hen building for the hens. It's like a ziggurat. It's stepped upwards, and on it there are various inscriptions, obviously for the benefit of the hens, saying "scratch before you peck." Menageries of exotic buildings were mainly a way of entertaining visitors, but apart from cages for the animals and birds, there might also be lavishly decorated provision for refreshments. This is the wonderful interior of the menagerie at Horton in Northamptonshire of the 1750s. Some of you will have heard of an architectural historian called Jervis Jackson Stopes, who was a leading light in the National Trust. Well, he, now dead, alas, he was responsible for rescuing this building from complete dereliction. Like a lot of these buildings, because it had outlived its purpose, it had been left to rot. And a lot of this wonderful plasterwork was out on the floor, but he very carefully gathered it together, stuck it back up again, and it makes the most and turned it into a little house for himself. Lucky thing. Another practical way of entertaining, particularly female guests, was the ornamental dairy. And the dairy, chinoiserie dairy at Woburn Abbey of about 1789 is the apotheosis in this country of the, what you might call the Duchess as dairymaid fantasy. And this was built for, obviously, the Duchess of Bedford. And she and her friends would go there, and inside, there's a wonderful inside with beautiful tiles and marble slabs and so on, and the finest ceramics, specially designed. And there'd be, the Duchess could do a little genteel churning of the milk in porcelain pails and make little pats of butter and so on. The famous example of this is Marie Antoinette's dairy at Rambouillet, where the pails used for milking the cows were of the finest Sèvres porcelain. The further visitors were encouraged to stray from the environs of the house, the more they were likely to need comfort stops. And although I don't think any of these have survived because they're mostly built of timber, you can see evidence of one in this plan by Thomas Wright for a garden for the Duke of Beaufort at Netheravon in Wiltshire of the 1750s. And this is only part of the plan, but there's a sort of windy walk, and there's a little temple or a Gothic seat. But then behind is this densely planted shrubbery. And somebody would tell you, if you were feeling the need, that you would follow the path round. It goes off like that, and then it wiggles up through the wood and arrives at the loo, which is, I think, a two-seater, or it might even be a three-seater. Now, throughout the British Isles, but particularly in England, the potentially enormous amount spent by owners in embellishing their estates were not just for their own benefit and that of their close family, but also for visitors who visited other people's estates in increasing numbers. If you think of Pride and Prejudice, for instance, you'll know that, gosh, what's her name? The heroine goes off on a tour with her aunt and uncle. What's her name? Sorry? Elizabeth Bennet, thank you. Elizabeth Bennet goes off with her aunt and uncle on a tour which takes them, for instance, to well, Mr. Darcy's house. But anyway, it is a fact that there was a gradual upsurge in the number of visitors to private estates. And at Stowe, the Duke of Buckingham's estate, the first guidebook dates from 1744. We tend to think of guidebooks as a rather modern phenomenon, but the earliest one, I think, is 1744. And it went through successive editions, and there were little vignettes of the various buildings that you would see. So you would follow the circuit with the guidebook in hand, and you'd come to a building, you'd go through, and oh yes, that's the so-and-so, and you'd sit down in it or do whatever, and then on you'd go. But there was a strong element of keeping up with the Joneses in all this, and the effort to impress people began immediately on arrival with the entrance lodges to the estate. So this is the pair of triangular lodges at Lulworth Castle, not a million miles from here, east of Dorchester, which they are triangular in plan. This drive is no longer used, but if you want, there is a public footpath goes up to them, but if you want to see them, if you go to Lulworth Castle and look north on the northern skyline of Lulworth, you will see these two little lodges like mini castles on the skyline. But they were meant to be seen obviously from the outside, but they were also meant as accommodation for estate workers. And all I can say is living in a small triangular room isn't my idea of fun, but they may have been glad for a roof over their head. This is a rather fun one. This is to the Castletown estate outside Dublin. This is the Leakslip Lodge, very much in Georgian Gothic style. This dates from the 1750s, probably. But the grandest example, I think, of all must be Worcester Lodge, the grand entrance to the Duke of Beaufort's estate at Badminton. You see this passing on the A road. If you go from, if you were going from Bath to Cirencester, you would almost inevitably spot this if you look at the right at the right point. And it's basically like a great triumphal arch. And it's what one writer on the subject has called a trumpet at a distant gate. It's a kind of fanfare saying somebody very important lives the other side of this. And indeed, if you were to be admitted, I mean, again, there were estate workers lived here in those little pyramids either side. And I know because I used to know the people who lived here. The sitting room is on the right, the bedroom is on the left. So to get from the sitting room to the bedroom, whatever the weather, you have to go outside, even if it's a howling gale. But if you are one of the fortunate, you are taken up a staircase into the great room over the arch. And from that room, you can look down a 4-mile avenue, at the end of which is the Ducal Palace of Badminton. And has a wonderful ceiling. This was designed by William Kent. Marvelous ceiling of plasterwork. And that is where the Duke of Beaufort would entertain his guests, and servants would be sent on ahead to prepare refreshments. You also get gates, so the entrance to estates. Castle Howard, which is an estate on a fairly heroic scale, even though Castle Howard itself is a Baroque building by Sir John Vanbrugh, and either side of 1700, the intention was to create, as you approach, to create the impression you were approaching a genuine castle. So the first thing you come to is this battlemented wall stretching away to either side, and a gate in the middle. As you go through the gate, continuing on the avenue, there, about a mile ahead, I suppose, perhaps not quite that, is another gate, the Pyramid Gate, designed by Vanbrugh. This is the triumphal arch to Holkham Hall in Norfolk. And again, this is the southern edge of the estate. You go through this arch and you see the avenue stretching ahead to an obelisk about 2 miles away. And it's only when you get to the obelisk that you top a rise and you look down, and there is your first glimpse of Holkham Hall, this great mansion of the Earls of Leicester. Again, there is sort of accommodation, and there is a little room over the arch. This is now, it's been done up as holiday accommodation, and I happen to know that when Alan Bennett, the playwright, stayed there, he said that the bedroom, the size was suitable only for sex-starved midgets. This is a rather fun entrance arch. This is the Hindu arch. Yes, Hindu arch at Dramana in County Waterford in Ireland. There's quite a good story attaches to this. In about 1820, I think it was, the young owner of the estate, who was called Mr. Villiers Stewart, I think, he got engaged and married, and he took his bride off to Brighton for the honeymoon. And they were away sufficiently long that when they came home, the estate workers had run up an arch in what they hoped was the Brighton Pavilion style, yes. I suppose to remind the young newlyweds of their nights of nuptial passion on the south coast of England. Probably the most spectacular of all this sort of entrance arch is the Connolly Folly, also in Ireland, the estate at Castletown. This was built in 1740 for the owner of Castletown, Mrs. Connolly, and the scale is epic. If I tell you that to the top of that obelisk it's 140 feet, you can see that they didn't stint the funds in creating the effect they wanted. Now, with the advent of the landscape park, which might cover hundreds, if not thousands of acres, and the ever-extending visitor circuit, paths and carriage drives might well be led across bridges and cascades of varying size and elaboration. The bridge at Blenheim, begun in 1708, was always the grandest, with the widest arch, 100 feet, of any bridge so far built in this country at the time. It was completed without this is how it was meant to look, but it was completed without that very elaborate superstructure. And indeed, the appearance has very much changed because as originally built, it had a rather tiddly little stream flowing underneath, the arch was out of all proportion to the stream. So Capability Brown thought that was rather a waste. He dammed the stream, flooded the valley, and what you now see when you go to Blenheim is this very magnificent structure crossing quite a sizable lake. The Palladian Bridge Wilton House is on a completely different scale, and it's a very elegant example of Palladianism, designed by the owner of the estate, the Earl of Pembroke, in 1736 to 7. And it takes you, that's the River Nadder that flows underneath it. To our left, if we were to turn left, we'd see Wilton House, and to the right is the park of Wilton House. And so the bridge is there to take visitors up and over the river without the necessity of a boat. So it only contains a footpath. It was followed very quickly by one at Stowe, which has a level. There are steps up, as you can see, but at Stowe it's on the level, so you could actually drive a carriage through. So it formed part of the carriage circuit. Here's one pretending to be the entrance to a great medieval fortress. This is at Ballysagotmoor in County Waterford, the fortified bridge. It's a rather Irish situation. The owner of the estate spent so much money on the bridge that he never got round to building the house. Sometimes the bridge would cross a cascade or be combined by a cascade, combined with a cascade. This is the rather charming bridge cascade at Halswell on the slopes of Quantocks, not too far from Bridgewater, which dates from 1755. So what that basically is a dam. In front of it is the dammed stream, but the water then flows through the arches either side, and immediately behind there's a cascade which takes the water down to a different level. And again, the carriage drive on the circuit passes across the top. This is a rather striking cascade house that's sadly lost its cascade at Stanway in Gloucestershire. This is on the scarp of the Cotswolds, and the water was penned into pools further up the hillside, and then it would be released. When there were visitors down below waiting to see the spectacle, it would be released. It would flow underneath this fine pavilion and down the slope in front. Doesn't do that anymore because the steps have just weathered away. Now, quite often cascades, particularly if they were made to look naturalistic, might be combined with a grotto. This is the cascade at Virginia Water on the Windsor estate, which was built in the 1750s for the Duke of Cumberland. And you can see that there is the cascade, which is entirely artificial, made with rocks hauled by, I think, soldiers from the army, because the Duke of Cumberland's the man who won the Battle of Culloden, always had access to lots of soldiers. So they formed the cascade, and adjoining it, just behind, it was obviously a rather wonderful grotto. So I'm now going to come on to grottos and shell houses. The origins of the grotto are lost in the myths of antiquity. The grotto was revived at the Renaissance, and the first example in England was built by the poet Alexander Pope in his garden at Twickenham in the 1720s. Henry Hall, the owner of Stourhead, made a grotto an important feature of the circuit of his wonderful landscape garden, dating from the late 1740s. So this is the grotto at Stourhead, and you can see it has the reclining figure of a marble nymph. The spring water that is the origin of the River Stour, that's why Stourhead is called Stourhead, is brought from behind the nymph over a mini cascade into an ice-cold pool. And in front of that is this domed grotto chamber. And if we were to turn the other way, we'd see the arch looking out over the lake, which is the central feature of Stourhead. I expect you've all been here. Inspired, I think, by Stourhead is this not at all well-known example at Barwick, which is an estate just to the south of Yeovil, probably dating from the 1770s. You get an idea, well, you may not be able to see, but you go through this arch and you're into a large domed circular chamber with a circular pool of spring water, and the statues on the far side give you some idea of scale. But grottos, in addition to being naturalistic, could be made very pretty. This is the grotto at Golden House, formed over quite a long period, absolutely encrusted with shells, minerals, quartzes, fossils, corals. It's a real little wonderland. And the purpose of that Gothic tower that I showed you quite a time back, with a water tank at the top, was that when there were visitors, a signal would be given and the water tank would be opened and the water would gush down through pipes and down a cascade, which is at the rear of the grotto chamber there. These columns, which divide the space up, are clad in something called Bristol diamonds, which are pinkish quartz crystals which occur naturally nearby in Clifton Gorge. A bit more naturalistic, this is a detail of the grotto at St Giles House, which is the home of the Earl of Shaftesbury over near Wimborne, near beyond Wimborne. And there the grotto, which cost a vast amount of money and used shells sent from the West Indies, is made to give you the impression that you're in an underwater cavern. You feel it should be populated by mermaids. Probably the most spectacular was the one at Painshill in Surrey, which has these extraordinary stalactites, completely artificial. This is an entirely above ground structure, but the idea is to persuade you that you've entered a naturalistic cavern with these great stalactites, which are clad in little flakes of Derbyshire spar. It cost so much that it bankrupted the owner, who had to sell up and move to a flat in Bath. We also get shell houses. Shells in grottos tend to be naturalistically arranged on the surfaces, but you can also get them disciplined into a very architectural effect. This is wonderful shell house at Goodwood, the home of the Duke of Richmond near Chichester, where there are squillions of shells, some of which certainly came from quite far afield, which have been disciplined to create the sort of Palladian decoration that would normally be either of carved wood or stone. And the color scheme of matching tones of pink and gray is really ravishing. We've got an example a bit closer to home. This is the shell house in Sherborne, which I venture to doubt any of you have actually seen. It's in the garden of one of the houses of Sherborne School, and it probably dates from the 1750s. And again, lots and lots of shells. These are mostly from the Dorset coast, as it happens, disciplined to form this very pretty architectural effect. And towards the end of my period comes this shell house at Jordan's near Ilminster, which has, as you can see, rather wonderful shells. Are they conch shells? I think they're conch shells. Ammonites. And you can see that in this case, they're surrounding a little engraved or etched mirror. And the up above are little windows with colored glass in. So as the sun moves around, pools of rather intense color move across the surface of the walls and across the shelves. And you can see there's a patch of blue and gold, which will shortly, after the photograph is taken, move on round the walls. Now, when we think of Georgian garden buildings, we perhaps tend to think of straightforward buildings like temples. And many of the first circular temples, like the one on the right at Stowe, the Temple of Ancient Virtue, were inspired by a Roman temple at Tivoli, south of Rome, the Temple of Vesta. So on the left is an engraving of the mid-18th century showing the circular Temple of Vesta, which by that stage was somewhat ruined. However, most people's idea of a temple is of a kind of shoebox with a pediment at each end and columns all the way around. And a typical example, though quite a grand one, is the Temple of Concord at Stowe, begun in 1747. But Stowe has a good many other buildings that were called temples, but don't really look like that. So here is the Temple of British Worthies, which is basically a structure that creates a pantheon of, creates a pantheon of people who the owner of the estate, Lord Cobham, thought were the great and good, which ranges from Queen Elizabeth I through to Alexander Pope, Shakespeare, and so on. And then at Stourhead, we have a much reduced version of the greatest temple to survive from Roman antiquity. This is the Pantheon in Rome, which is basically a circular domed building with a portico in front. And this is the rather splendid interior designed to contain what I think are mostly antique statues of gods and goddesses. I mentioned temples quite a long way back. Here are a couple of Dorset examples set on their respective hilltops. On the left is the Horton Tower for the Horton estate, which is basically triangular. And if you know the film Far from the Madding Crowd with Julie Christie, Sergeant Troy attends a cockfight in this particular structure. And then on the coast at Kimmeridge is Clavel's Tower, which is right on the edge of the cliff, but you can actually stay in it. It belongs to the Landmark Trust and was built in about 1830 for the local squire, who was also the local vicar, what we call a squarson. Some of the finest, and here's probably my favorite tower. This is the Brisley Tower on the Alnwick estate, the estate of the Duke of Northumberland, which is a sort of Gothic rocket ship designed by Robert Adam. We think of Robert Adam as a classical architect, but every now and then he did venture into Gothic with, I think, very enjoyable results. Some of the finest buildings by their respective architects turn out to be pavilions in gardens. This is the Marino Casino on the outskirts of Dublin, designed by the leading neoclassical English architect, Sir William Chambers, actually made of stone from Portland, so shipped all the way around the coast to Dublin, then unloaded and formed into this very fine pavilion. Looking at it, you might guess that it had just one big room inside, but actually it's a kind of three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle and contains 13 rooms in the hidden basement and up in the attic. This is a rather entertaining example of Georgian Gothic. This is the Red House in the Rococo Garden at Painswick, which I'm sure some of you must have visited. And the interesting thing here is that the facade consists of two non-matching halves. You would think that perhaps it ought to be symmetrical and there's a bit missing, but there isn't. It was always like this. And the two parts are angled slightly differently, so that from the left-hand one, you look down the axis through the middle of the garden. From the right-hand one, you look down a perimeter path that wiggles around the outside. Here's a more local one. This is in the grounds of Melbury House. This is Townsend's estate. And this is a rather pretty mid-18th century example, I think, of Georgian Gothic with a sort of umbrella vault inside. And This is the aptly named Pineapple at Dunmore in Stirlingshire. It's basically an octagonal Gothic summer house sitting on top of a now vanished range of glass houses in which pineapples were raised at considerable expense. But you'll see that the octagonal summer house going upwards, instead of having the usual cornice and pitched roof or even a dome, metamorphoses into a giant stone pineapple. And each of those out-curving leaves of the pineapple has its own drainage channel to avert the risk of frost. So this is certainly one of the most extraordinary buildings put up in any 18th century garden, I think. Just want to whiz through a few examples of what we might call ruins or follies or eye catchers. Here we have the fortifications at Castle Howard, part of the effort to persuade visitors that you were about to visit a real medieval castle. But these were all run up in either side of 1720. In the mid-18th century, they started putting up castles which were meant to look as if they'd been there for hundreds of years, but had only just been built. This is the castle at Hagley, which has always looked like has always been a deliberate ruin, evoking a genuine medieval castle. Here's a very unconvincing eye catcher. This is Creech Grange, which you may have driven past. It's on the Isle of Purbeck, and it's basically an eye catcher for the house, which is down at the bottom of the hill, and you see this against the skyline. And since it was only seen from quite a distance, they didn't need to spend very much effort, and indeed, nor did they. Barwick, the estate near Yeovil that I mentioned, has got a very good crop of follies. On the left is the Treacle-eater, and on the right, the Rose Tower, with the hills of central Dorset in the distance. The Treacle-eater it's a genuine folly. You'll see that atop this pepper pot is a figure going sort of like so, which is actually a figure of Mercury, the messenger god. However, the story that goes with this is that it commemorates a very athletic footman called Jack, who lived on treacle to give himself energy, and who saved the family postage by running up and down the countryside delivering their mail. Some of the best follies inevitably are in Ireland. This is the Fox's Earth at Larchill, an estate west of Dublin. This was built by a squire who was mad about fox hunting. And he killed so many foxes in his life that he was convinced that when he died, he would be reincarnated as a fox and would be hunted. And so he built this structure with a rather clever plan. You enter it by that arch. A human being can just about squeeze through, but then to left and right are very low, narrow arches through which a fox can get, but a foxhound can't, and a human being certainly can't. So all tailored for his life in the afterlife. Here's another Irish one. This is the Jealous Wall at Belvedere. The owner of this estate, the Earl of Belvedere, was a very cultured man, but not a very nice man. And he fell out with everybody, including with his wife and with his two brothers. One of his brothers, who he suspected was having an affair with his wife, went on the run, but eventually was caught and locked up in a debtor's prison in Dublin, where he died. The other brother, who had an adjoining estate, he couldn't stand the sight of him either. So he built this enormous wall, which is pretending to be a ruined abbey or a ruined castle. It's a good 60 feet to the top, so that it blocked the view from Lord Belvedere's house to his brother's house. And that story is that you would think, gosh, that can't be true, but it is actually true. But we are talking about Ireland. Now, some of the very finest structures, architecturally speaking, in Georgian landscapes are what you might call commemorative or memorial structures. This is the Rockingham Monument, sorry, at Wentworth Woodhouse in Yorkshire, which is basically a memorial to the Earl of Rockingham, who was a leading politician of the time. And the antique source for this is a genuine Roman building in Provence, near Saint-Rémy, which some of you may possibly have visited. Churches and chapels could also be pressed into service to form embellishments of the estate. Here's one nearer to hand. This is the Catholic chapel in the grounds of Lulworth Castle. The story here, which is a genuine one, is that George III, on holiday in Weymouth, visited Mr. Weld, and Mr. Weld and his forebears had always been Catholics, and in the late 18th century, they were not allowed to have freestanding chapels. They had to be secreted away in the house. Anyway, Mr. Weld said to the king, Your Majesty, do you think I could possibly build myself a Catholic chapel in the grounds? And the king said, yes, fine, as long as it doesn't look like a chapel. And so it was designed to look like a garden temple with a dome. And finally, we come to the mausoleum at Castle Howard, which is, has anybody here been to Castle Howard? Well, please do, it's wonderful. If you go to the house and you look out into the landscape, it's on a vast scale. And dead ahead of you, you will see a Roman pyramid. And then to the left is a Temple of the Four Winds. And at about, 10 o'clock is the mausoleum. It's on a distant hilltop, and it's where the Earls of Carlisle and their descendants have always been buried. But it was designed by Nicholas Hawksmoor, who I think is one of the very greatest of English architects, to look like a giant garden temple. So you have these enormous columns, which are 70 feet high, so something of the scale you can see from the two chaps who are beetling up the hillside. And then if you go inside, there's this wonderful interior, really thrilling and awe-inspiring. And Horace Walpole, who could always be relied on for a good quote, said it was so good, it was enough to tempt one to be buried alive. And I think probably on that note, it's time to finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really entertaining and enlightening lecture, which gives one the urge to rush out and visit these parks. Unfortunately, it is too cold at the moment, but as soon as the weather warms up, I know that is what I'm going to do. Our speaker, despite his voice problems, is prepared to take questions from the audience. So I wonder if anybody would like to start off with a question.
I must say, going in pursuit of garden buildings is wonderful exercise, lots of fresh air. One's endlessly sort of spotting a temple or a tower on a distant hilltop and feeling you've got to go and look at it. I imagine that from time to time it was slavery, but it was whatever the estate drew its income from. It might be mines, coal. Up north, a lot of people had coal mines. Land obviously generated rents. There might be property in London. I think there are all sorts of sources of income. I mean, in the case of the grotto at St. Giles House, we know that the shells were provided by Alderman Beckford from his estates in Jamaica, which were undoubtedly slave estates. They were what had made him one of the richest men in the country. In the case of the shell house at Goodwood, we know that the Duchess of Richmond formed a very select consortium with the Duchess of Bedford, and they ordered a shipload of shells from the South Seas, which I assume probably moored at Portsmouth, and then the shells were divided up and half went to Goodwood, where they were turned into the shell house. I have no idea what the Duchess of Bedford did with hers, because there isn't a shell house at Woburn.
The ground and the building, or were they brought in together? Was there an overall plan from the word go?
Well, it depends. Quite often there would be an existing country house, which might be very old. You know, it might be Elizabethan, might even be medieval. And then they would decide that in order to be sort of a la mode, they needed one of these newfangled things called a landscape park. So they'd, even if they already had a formal garden, which a lot of them did with straight avenues and so on, they would transform it into something fashionably irregular that had to be dotted with garden buildings. So it's a bit of both, really.
And I suppose they evolved. I mean, did they keep on adding things?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, in the case of Stowe, I've slightly lost track of how many buildings that ended up with. At Stowe, I mean, the motto of Lord Cobham, who lived at Stowe, was translated means how delightful are they. Well, his name was Temple. He was Earl Temple, and his punning motto was how delightful are thy temples. So he was kind of obliged to pepper his landscape with temples, and he did keep adding and adding and adding, which is why the guidebook had to keep being updated. And then in the 1750s, 60s, Cape Bertie Brown came along, because the sort of landscape that was being created in the 40s and 50s was rather, or could be rather congested. And Cape Bertie Brown, with his new approach to landscapes, thought that there should be fewer garden buildings. So in the case of Stowe, he pruned the buildings back a bit, but there are still, I think, more than 30 garden structures of one sort or another dotted around the landscape at Stowe.
One practical building you didn't mention, I notice, is the ice house. And there is one, I believe, in Sherborne Castle.
Which I haven't seen.
Ah.
There is one in my book. For the most part, I mean, the point of an ice house is that it keeps the ice cold. And for that reason, they almost always faced north, and they also tended to be dug into north-facing hillsides, often with trees around to keep the sun altogether. So for the most part, they were a practical thing. And it wasn't very often that an architectural effort was made. But there's one in my book, which is over there, on an estate called Buckland in Oxfordshire, which does have a portico. Or they might be combined with a grotto, for instance.
Oh, yeah. Any other questions in the room? Well, if there are no more questions, it only remains me to thank the speaker once again for an absolutely fabulous talk. And I would remind you that his book is available online and in
good booksellers.
Good booksellers, and I'm sure you can get it from Waterstones in Dorchester. And do have a look at it, the specimen copy. And I've also bought in my copy of the earlier book, which is on the cottage ornée. We have a marvelous example, actually, just on West Walks there, overlooking the yeah. Oh, yes. Well, I can show you it actually when we leave tonight, if you don't mind the cold. I'll send you a photograph of it. There we are. Well, thank you again.